Close your eyes for a moment and imagine you are about to be born. Not in a warm hospital room with soft blankets and steady electric light, but in a wooden hut with a dirt floor somewhere in Europe in the year 1310. The air smells of smoke and damp straw. Outside, winter feels longer than it should. Crops are failing. People whisper about hunger. No one knows that within a single generation, nearly half of everyone they know may be gone. If there was ever a time in history when being born was almost a death wish, it was the 14th century. Before we step deeper into this world, I want to invite you to gently support this little corner of history. If you find yourself drawn into the story tonight, consider liking the video, subscribing, or sharing it with someone who loves strange and powerful chapters of the past. And tell me in the comments, where in the world are you listening from? I always imagine these stories travelling quietly across oceans and time zones. Now dim the lights a little, let the room grow softer, and let's drift back more than 700 years. To understand why the 14th century was so brutal, we have to begin with a simple fact: survival itself was fragile. Life expectancy at birth in much of Europe hovered around 30 to 35 years. That number can be misleading because if you survive childhood, you might live longer. But that was the problem. Childhood was a battlefield. In some regions, historians estimate that between 30 and 50% of children died before reaching adulthood. No antibiotics, no vaccines, no understanding of bacteria. A fever could mean death. A small cut could turn fatal. And this was before the worst arrived. Between the years 1315 and 1317, Europe was struck by what we now call the Great Famine. Relentless rain destroyed crops across England, France, the Low Countries and parts of Germany. Grain rotted in the fields, livestock starved. Contemporary chronicles describe parents too weak to work the land, and in the darkest accounts even whispers of cannibalism. Modern historians estimate that 10 to 15% of the population in some areas died during these years alone. Imagine being born into that. Your first lullaby is the sound of rain that will not stop. And yet here is a common misunderstanding. People in the Middle Ages were not ignorant or careless. They worked incredibly hard. Most families depended entirely on the land. A bad harvest was not an inconvenience. It was a death sentence. They prayed, they rationed, they shared when they could. But climate shift, what some scholars call the onset of the Little Ice Age, made growing food increasingly unpredictable. In today's world, if one region suffers drought, food can be shipped from another continent within days. In the 14th century, your survival depended almost entirely on what grew within walking distance. So before the famous plague ships ever appeared on the horizon, before the rats and fleas carried something far more terrifying, the 14th century had already shown its teeth. Being born then meant stepping into a world where hunger was common, medicine was guesswork, and death was familiar. Childhood was not a protected space. It was a test. And we have not even reached the year 1347 yet. Because what followed the famine would not just challenge survival, it would redefine what it meant to be alive in Europe. Let's take a slow breath and move toward the shadow that changed history forever. Now, just as the soil began to recover from years of hunger, something far more terrifying arrived. Picture a merchant ship drifting into the port of Messina in Sicily in the year 1347. The crew is sick. Some are already dead. Those still alive have black swellings under their arms and along their necks. Fever burns through them. Within days, the illness spreads from the docks into the city streets. This was the beginning of what we now call the Black Death. Over the next 4 years, the plague swept across Europe with a speed no one could understand. Modern estimates suggest that between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population died between 1347 and 1351. In some cities like Florence, contemporary writers such as Giovanni Boccaccio described entire households dying within days. In England, tax records suggest that around 40% of the population perished. Imagine nearly half of your town simply gone. Can you picture walking through your neighbourhood and every other house standing empty? The disease caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis and spread primarily by fleas on rats was invisible to medieval people. They blamed bad air divine punishment or strange planetary alignments. Without germ theory, they had no real defence. Doctors wore long robes and beaked masks stuffed with herbs, hoping pleasant smells would block the sickness. It did not. Here is something chilling. If you were born around 1330, you would have been a teenager when the plague struck, old enough to understand what was happening, young enough to watch your parents, your siblings, your friends fall ill one by one. And yet in the middle of unimaginable loss, something unexpected happened. Survivors suddenly found themselves in a world with fewer workers. Labour became more valuable. In England, wages rose. Peasants began demanding better conditions. The social order, which had seemed fixed for centuries, started to crack. Out of devastation, change was quietly growing. But let's not rush toward hope just yet, because even after the plague loosened its grip, Europe did not settle into peace. Fewer people did not mean fewer conflicts. In fact, the next threat did not come from fleas or famine. It came from other human beings. As if disease had not taken enough, the 14th century had another habit. It loved war. Not quick, distant wars that you only read about in a newspaper, but long, grinding conflicts that stretched across generations. If you were born in this century, there was a strong chance you would grow up under the shadow of the 100 Years' War, which began in the year 1337 between England and France. Despite its name, it lasted 116 years. Imagine being a farmer in northern France. One season you're planting wheat. The next, foreign soldiers march across your fields, trampling crops, burning barns, seizing livestock. Armies in medieval Europe often lived off the land. That land was your pantry, your savings account, your entire future. During the early phase of the war, the English victory at the Battle of Crécy in the year 1346 demonstrated the terrifying power of the longbow. Thousands of French soldiers were killed in a single day. Later, at the Battle of Poitiers in the year 1356, even the French King John II was captured. Think about that for a second. Your king, the symbol of stability, taken prisoner. And war was not limited to France and England. In the Iberian Peninsula, Christian kingdoms continued fighting Muslim states in the later stages of the Reconquista. In Eastern Europe, the Teutonic Knights battled their neighbours. Across the continent, conflict was a constant companion. Here is something we rarely talk about. War in the 14th century was deeply personal. There were no clear front lines for civilians. Raids, sieges, forced conscription. If you were a young man, you might be pulled into service. If you were a young woman, you might face displacement, hunger, or worse. Castles were not fairy tale backdrops. They were military targets. Let me ask you something. When you think about growing up, what do you imagine school dances, first jobs? In the 14th century, growing up might mean learning how to survive a siege, or how to flee your village before soldiers arrived. And yet, in a strange twist, war also reshaped society. The heavy losses among nobles weakened feudal structures. Common soldiers with longbows and pikes proved they could defeat armoured knights. The myth of invincible aristocratic warriors began to crumble. Still, even when the battlefield grew quiet, fear did not disappear. Because beyond famine, plague and war, there was another force shaping daily life. Something less visible but just as powerful. Belief. That survival in the 14th century was not only threatened by hunger, disease or war, it was also shaped by something far more intimate. What people believed about the world, about God, and about each other. After the Black Death tore through Europe, faith did not disappear. In many ways it intensified. Churches filled with desperate prayers, processions of flagellants marched through towns, whipping themselves in public, believing that pain might persuade God to end the plague. Imagine watching that as a child. Grown men crying in the streets convinced the world might be ending. At the same time, fear needed a target. In the year 1348 and 1349 Jewish communities across parts of Germany, France and Switzerland were falsely accused of poisoning wells to cause the plague. In Strasbourg on St. Valentine's Day in 1349, nearly 2,000 Jewish men, women and children were burned alive or expelled from the city. They had nothing to do with the disease, but in an age without scientific explanations, rumour could be as deadly as infection. Let that sink in. Being born into the wrong community could become a death sentence overnight, and it was not only minorities who faced spiritual uncertainty. The authority of the church itself was shaken during what historians call the Western Schism, beginning in the year 1378. For nearly 40 years, rival popes claimed legitimacy, one in Rome and one in Avignon. Ordinary believers were left wondering which one truly speaks for God. Can you imagine turning on the news today and hearing that there are two popes both declaring the other illegitimate? For many people, this crisis created deep anxiety. If salvation depended on the church and the church was divided, what did that mean for your soul? In a world where death was already everywhere, spiritual confusion added another layer of fear. And yet something subtle was happening beneath the surface. Questions were being asked. Doubts were forming. The seeds of later reform movements were quietly planted in this soil of crisis. So here we are. Hunger tested the body. Plague tested survival. War tested safety. And belief itself was tested by doubt and fear. And somehow, people endured, which brings us to the final and perhaps most surprising truth about being born in the 14th century. Because despite everything, this was not only an age of endings, it was also the beginning of something new. And yet, here is the twist no one expects. For all its darkness, the 14th century did something extraordinary. It forced change. When nearly half of Europe's population died during the plague years, the balance of power quietly shifted. Land was suddenly abundant. Labour was scarce. In England, records show that wages for agricultural workers rose sharply in the decades after 1351. So sharply, in fact, that the government tried to freeze them with the Statute of Labourers in the year 1351. Imagine that. For the first time in generations, ordinary workers had leverage. Some peasants left the manors where their families had been tied for centuries. Others negotiated better terms. In the year 1381, frustration over taxes and labour laws exploded into the peasants' revolt in England. Thousands marched on London. They demanded fairness. Even though the revolt was eventually crushed, the old feudal system never fully recovered. Would any of this have happened without the catastrophe that came before it? Meanwhile, in cities like Florence, Venice and Milan, commerce slowly revived. Banking families such as the Medici would rise in the following century, but their foundations were laid in this period of rebuilding. Scarcity encouraged innovation. Record-keeping improved. Trade networks adapted. Even culturally, something subtle was awakening. Writers like Giovanni Boccaccio, who lived through the plague, captured human emotion with new realism in works such as the Decameron. Instead of focusing only on saints and kings, stories began to explore ordinary people, their flaws, their humour, their desires. It was as if surviving so much suffering made people look more closely at what it meant to be human. And here is a quiet irony. If you were born in the early 1400s, just a few decades after the worst waves of plague, you might have inherited a world with more opportunity than your grandparents ever knew. The Renaissance, that explosion of art and thought we often admire, did not appear out of nowhere. It grew from the ashes of this brutal century. So let me ask you something softly as the story begins to settle. If survival was rare, if childhood was fragile, if faith was shaken and war was constant, does that make the 14th century only a nightmare? Or does it also reveal something about human resilience? Being born in that era was almost a death wish. Statistically, brutally, it was one of the hardest centuries to begin a life in Europe. And yet from famine came adaptation. From plague came social change. From war came the weakening of rigid hierarchies. from doubt came new ways of thinking. The people of the 14th century did not know they were standing at the edge of transformation. They were simply trying to survive one more winter. And maybe that is the most powerful part of this story. Thank you for drifting through this century with me tonight. If this journey helped you see history a little differently, I would love for you to stay connected for the next story we unravel together. There are many more forgotten nights in the past waiting for us. For now, take a slow breath and remember how extraordinary it is simply to be born in a time where survival is no longer the rarest gift of all. Before we let this century fade into the dark, let us sit with it just a little longer. History books sometimes compress the 1400s into a few dramatic headlines: famine, plague, war, schism, revolt. But for the people who lived through it, this was not a chapter. It was their entire life. Imagine being born around the year 1320. As a child, you hear stories of failed harvests and hunger. As a teenager, you watch the Black Death carry away neighbours in days. In your 20s, soldiers march across the countryside. In your 30s, you hear that there are two popes arguing over who truly speaks for God. If you somehow reach old age, you have outlived half the people you once knew, and yet you're still here. That is the part that moves me the most. Modern demographic historians estimate that Europe's population may have fallen from around 75 million people before the plague to perhaps 50 million or fewer by the early 1350s. Entire villages disappeared. Fields returned to forest. But within a few generations, population numbers began to recover. Markets reopened. Universities continued teaching. Cathedrals kept rising stone by stone. Survival was rare, but survival was also stubborn. It is easy for us sitting comfortably in the 21st century to look back and think I could never live through that. No antibiotics, no reliable food supply, no central heating. Honestly, many of us panic when the internet goes down for 10 minutes. But here is a gentle reminder. The people of the 14th century did not think of themselves as living in the most brutal era. They woke up each morning and did what humans have always done. They adapted. They loved. They complained about taxes. They laughed at jokes. They told stories by firelight. And maybe that is why this century still matters. Because it shows us something powerful about the human story. Catastrophe does not automatically erase civilization. Sometimes it reshapes it. The labour shortages after the plague weakened rigid feudal bonds. Social mobility, though uneven, became more possible in certain regions. Intellectual questions planted during the Western Schism contributed to later reform movements. Economic shifts helped lay foundations for the Renaissance that would bloom in the 15th century. Out of almost unimaginable loss came transformation. So was being born in the 14th century almost a death wish? Statistically, yes. Infant mortality was shockingly high. A third to a half of the population died in a single pandemic. Warfare and persecution were constant threats. If we measure purely by survival odds, it was one of the harshest centuries in European history to begin a life. But if we measure by resilience and by the quiet determination to rebuild after everything collapses, it may also be one of the most revealing centuries about who we are as a species. The next time you feel overwhelmed by headlines or uncertainty, remember those wooden huts, those rain-soaked fields, those plague ships in distant harbours. Remember that even in a world without modern science or safety nets, people endured long enough to pass the world down to us. And that is no small miracle. Thank you for spending this time travelling back through one of history's darkest centuries with me. If this story helped you see the past with new eyes, stay close. There are many more nights, many more forgotten eras waiting for us to explore together. Until our next journey, rest well, and appreciate how extraordinary it is to be alive right now.